Lena stared at her phone, staring at the message again and again, as if rereading it would somehow erase the knot in her stomach. Family dinner this Friday at La Belle Maison. Would love for you to join us. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Could it really be, after years of feeling invisible in her own family, after birthdays that were forgotten, and holiday gatherings she was never included in, could this finally be an olive branch? Her heart wanted to believe it, but her mind whispered the old warnings. They've never really wanted you here, Lena. You've always been the outsider, the cousin who doesn't belong, the niece whose presence is more tolerated than welcomed. Still, she tried to summon hope. Maybe things had changed. Maybe Aunt Marcy had softened, or maybe her cousins had grown enough to see her not as a shadow, but as a person worthy of laughter and company. Lena imagined the warm glow of candlelight, the clinking of wine glasses, the soft hum of conversation around her. For a moment she allowed herself to picture it, a family united, a place at the table for her. Friday evening arrived, and Lena found herself standing outside La Belle Maison, the fine dining restaurant glowing in the early twilight. The air smelled of roasted herbs and promise. She smoothed her dress, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her chest. When she walked through the door, she felt a pang of pride. She looked confident, put together, and most importantly, present. Tonight, maybe, she would finally belong. Her heart sank almost immediately. The table stretched out before her like a fortress, gleaming under the soft chandelier light. Her cousins laughed, their faces radiant with recognition and comfort, but only in each other's presence. She hesitated, and that hesitation caught her uncle's eye. This table, he said slowly, almost theatrically, is for family. Lena's breath caught. She stared at him, trying to gauge if he was joking, but the polite, almost cruel tilt of his lips told her everything. For family, he repeated, this time more pointedly, gesturing toward a small, corner table far from the laughter and warmth. She felt her chest tighten. The words weren't just exclusionary. They were a verdict. She was not, and never had been, part of this family. Not really. Lena swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile as she followed the waiter to the tiny table in the corner. From this distance, she could see the joyous chaos of her relatives, their stories, their jokes, their effortless comfort with one another. And she could feel, more acutely than ever, the years of absence that had brought her here. The waiter handed her the menu, but Lena's eyes barely registered the words. Her mind replayed every childhood gathering she had longed to attend, every holiday party where she sat silently while others celebrated, every whispered reminder that she didn't belong. Her throat tightened, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not yet. She took a deep breath and lifted the wine glass before her. It was hers alone. Tonight, she would watch, she would endure, and she would survive. But beneath the quiet resignation, a small ember of something dangerous stirred. Betrayal had a taste, and Lena was beginning to remember it well. The candle flickered on the table, and she realized that being excluded didn't make her invisible. It made her an observer. And observers, if they were clever enough, could see everything the participants never noticed. Lena sat alone at her small corner table, the dim candlelight reflecting off the crystal glass. In front of her, around her, laughter floated through the air like an insult, sharp and carefree. The clinking of silverware, the soft hum of voices, the way her cousins leaned in close to share private jokes, it all reminded her that she was on the outside. Always on the outside. She picked at the bread on her plate, trying to force herself to eat, but every bite felt tasteless. Every laugh from the main table twisted something inside her. How could they be so comfortable, so confident in their belonging, while she, who had shared the same blood, felt so hollow and invisible? She remembered birthdays she had spent alone, holidays she had silently watched from a distance, and family reunions where she had been the last to arrive and the first to leave. Every moment reinforced the truth. In their eyes she was expendable. The waiter approached, his expression polite, careful. "Would you like to start with the duck confit, ma'am?" he asked. Lena nodded mechanically, her hands trembling slightly. Soon the luxurious dishes began to arrive, plated beautifully, one after another. each one a reminder that her presence here was tolerated at best, but never embraced. She tried to keep her composure. She smiled when her cousin's eyes flicked her way, forced small laughter at the occasional joke, but inside, the hurt was simmering, a quiet fire she refused to let anyone see. She had spent so many years swallowing the sting of exclusion that she had become an expert at masking it, but tonight, every memory she had tried to bury clawed its way back to the surface. Her mind drifted back to childhood, sitting at the edge of the pool while her cousins splashed and played, waiting for someone to notice her, watching them open gifts while she received nothing but polite nods and half-hearted smiles, and the whispered, cruel assurances from adults that she was different, that she would understand someday. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been years in the making. She glanced at the main table. They were oblivious to her gaze, wrapped in their laughter, their stories, their shared history. And yet, in that oblivion, Lena felt a clarity she hadn't experienced before. She wasn't powerless. She didn't need their acknowledgement to exist. She could watch, she could remember, and most importantly, she could plan. The waiter returned, setting down the final dish with a quiet flourish. Lena reached for the menu to ask for the bill, but instead, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. She opened it and froze. The total stared back at her, $2,200. Her jaw tightened. She had expected exclusion, but this audacious, extravagant demand, was a slap she couldn't ignore. Her chest burned with anger, mingled with a strange sense of possibility. For the first time, she realized that the betrayal, the cruelty, the dismissive laughter, it wasn't just a wound. It was fuel. She folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into her purse. There would be a reckoning, she thought. Not tonight, not with shouting or tears, but a reckoning that would make them see, truly see, the cost of their arrogance. For now, she would sit, endure, and observe. The ember that had been smoldering in her heart for years began to glow brighter, a promise of sweet revenge yet to come. She was alone, yes, but alone could be powerful. Lena lifted her glass once more, letting the candlelight catch in the liquid, and whispered softly to herself, almost like a vow, "One day they will remember my name." The days after the dinner passed in a haze of anger, hurt, and a growing sense of determination. Lena replayed every detail of that night over and over, the cold glance of her uncle, the casual cruelty in her aunt's smile, the laughter that had floated around her as if she were a ghost. The $2,200 bill was not just a financial burden, it was a declaration. They were comfortable, wealthy, and unbothered by her presence, and she was expected to absorb their indifference with grace. But Lena had realized something crucial. Their arrogance was predictable, and predictable was exploitable. She began observing, not in the open, of course. Lena knew that patience was the key. She remembered the little things they flaunted, the vanity that could be used against them. Aunt Marcy loved her exotic wines, Uncle George was proud of his rare cigars, and the cousins flaunted expensive gadgets and carefully curated social media lives. Every detail, every weakness, every obsession was a thread Lena could pull to weave her plan. Her revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't involve shouting, confrontation, or tears. That was too simple, too obvious. This had to be subtle, perfect, and unforgettable. She wanted them to realize slowly that they had underestimated her, ignored her, and excluded her, all while they basked in their illusion of superiority. She started small. Anonymous messages arrived at their homes, small notes, accompanying packages that perfectly matched their tastes. Aunt Marcy received a selection of rare wines, each bottle carefully chosen from the regions she had bragged about in casual conversation. Uncle George found a vintage humidor on his doorstep, stocked with cigars more expensive than anything he had ever purchased himself. The cousins, not to be outdone, received gadgets and luxury items that left them bewildered, thrilled, and slightly unsettled. No signatures, no explanations, only perfection. Lena watched from a distance as the first whispers began. Who could have sent this? How did they know? The thrill she felt was nothing like the satisfaction of revenge stories she had read about in books. This was hers, quiet, intelligent, and deeply personal. She relished in their confusion, their need to understand what was happening without realizing the architect, was someone they had dismissed, someone they had left at the table in the corner. Each delivery was timed perfectly, exploiting their routines and vulnerabilities. Lena kept meticulous records, reactions on social media, whispered conversations overheard through mutual contacts, and the subtle pride that they each felt, only to be tainted by the lingering question, who knew them this well. Through it all, Lena transformed. The girl who had once been invisible, hurt, and excluded became someone careful, powerful, and patient. The fire that had begun as hurt now burned with precision. She realized that revenge wasn't about anger. It was about reclaiming her power and demonstrating her worth in a way that they could never ignore. And yet, she didn't gloat. She remained invisible, the quiet force behind their astonishment. Watching them unravel, slightly, subtly, gave her more satisfaction than any confrontation ever could. The same family that had told her, "This table is for family," was now haunted by the presence of someone they had underestimated, someone they had dismissed. Lena smiled softly, her hands folded over her journal where she had documented everything. One day, they might trace the gifts back to her. But even if they never did, the lesson had been delivered. Exclusion had consequences, and Lena had learned how to wield hers beautifully. The weeks passed, and Lena felt a quiet satisfaction as the ripples of her carefully orchestrated revenge began to settle over her family. She wasn't watching directly anymore. She didn't need to. The effects of her actions were unmistakable. Aunt Marcy's conversations hinted at unease, Uncle George's pride now mingled with confusion, and her cousins were cautiously proud but suspicious, unsure of how someone could know them so well. Lena allowed herself a private smile. The invisible hand that had been dismissed for so long had become an invisible power no one could ignore. For the first time in her life, Lena felt fully seen not by them, but by herself. She realized that the emptiness she had carried for years wasn't solely caused by their neglect. It had been compounded by her own need for their approval. The lesson was hard but invaluable. She didn't need validation from people who couldn't recognize her worth. She could create her own value, her own joy, and her own power. The memory of that first night at La Belle Maison still lingered, the cold, polished voice of her uncle declaring, "This table is for family," and the sting of isolation as she sat in the corner. But that memory, once sharp with pain, now carried a different weight. It was the catalyst for her transformation. That exclusion, that cruelty, had pushed her into clarity, forcing her to understand her own strength, her own intelligence, and her own agency. She thought about the gifts, the notes, the subtle interventions that had unnerved her family. It had been more than material indulgence. It had been a carefully crafted mirror, reflecting back to them the consequences of arrogance and neglect. And yet Lena didn't feel cruel. She had acted with precision, intelligence, and most importantly, without malice. Revenge, she realized, didn't have to destroy. It could illuminate. Lena felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She was no longer defined by their indifference. She could walk into any room, any gathering, and exist fully without their approval. Their whispers and speculation about the anonymous benefactor had begun to take on a life of their own, but Lena didn't need to be part of it. Their astonishment, their frustration, and their quiet admiration were enough. She had spoken without words, taught lessons without confrontation, and reclaimed dignity without compromise. One afternoon, she returned to the tiny corner table of her favorite cafe, a place she had long frequented alone. The sun filtered through the windows, casting patterns on the wooden floor. She smiled, thinking of that extravagant dinner that had begun her journey. The corner that had once symbolized exclusion now felt like a vantage point, a place of observation, reflection, and ultimately empowerment. Lena raised her cup of tea and whispered quietly, not for anyone to hear, but for herself, "I am enough. I always was." And with that affirmation, she realized the most profound truth of all. The table they had denied her was meaningless, for she had built her own table, her own space, her own life, and it was far richer than anything they could ever offer. As she walked out of the cafe, the world felt larger, brighter, and brimming with possibility. The family who had once tried to define her absence would remember her, not through a chair at a dinner, but through the presence she had cultivated, the intelligence she had wielded, and the quiet, undeniable power of a person who refused to be invisible any longer. Lena had been excluded, but she had won, not through confrontation, but through transformation.